I am confused and frankly a little disappointed in what happened today at Once on This Island when I went along to watch it for the first time ever. Didn't really know anything about it going into it, just knew that it had been critically acclaimed in the past, but it had been a while since it was on. I got there and there were so many empty seats and I was like, okay, surely there's something wrong with this show. Like maybe I've not seen the negative reviews that have been attacking it for whatever reason. Maybe it's got some kind of glaring issue that means that everyone's gone, you know what, actually, it's not for me. So let me get through some of this review today and we'll talk about whether or not that was the case. So the background context here is that Once on This Island is based on the 1985 novel My Love, My Love by Rosa Guy, and that itself is a Caribbean retelling of the story of The Little Mermaid. I believe it was first staged on Broadway in 1990 or so, and then slightly later in the West End here in London. In both cases, it was really, really well received, and it's had a couple of different retellings over the years, and in all of those, it's more or less followed the same sort of track in terms of the narrative, where it starts off, there's some kind of storm happening, scary sort of stuff outside. These kids are scared, they need to be comforted, and in order to comfort them, they are told this story. The story is of a girl who saves a boy's life and subsequently falls in love with him. The boy turns out to be from a rich family while she's just a peasant girl, and so she pursues the boy, only inevitably to find that it isn't possible for them to be together because they're from two different worlds. In telling this story, as far as I can tell, and again, I haven't seen any previous productions of this, but in telling it on Broadway, for instance, and here in the West End, I believe as well, there's often been a lot of effort put into the staging, the set design, things of that nature, to make you feel as within the island story as possible. So at one point there were like live goats that were present. You've got like massive palm trees built into theaters, feelings of gusting wind and the storm being real with you almost. All these sorts of elements to try and transport you into this island paradise and kind of suspend your disbelief while the story unfolds in front of you. But the 2023 Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, which is a really interesting place for a production like this to end up, the production there that I saw today has approached things in quite a different manner. For starters, the framing of the story, that initial opening, is not just a scary storm outside, but actually it's set in modern day Haiti. The two children that are scared by the storm in prior productions are in this one sort of beaten up a little bit and kind of hit and hurt by a member of the local militia. He isn't just targeting the kids, but he's basically just sort of wading through a crowd of these local people and battering and bruising them as he goes. And so it's to comfort the kids from that presence that the story is told. This is, I think, an important detail and an important choice, partially because the Haitian presence and Haitian culture ends up being paramount through the story. It's really, really vitally important, but also because the theme of this outside force or this antagonizing force barging its way through your friends and family and community is important to the story, but dealt with in a couple of different ways that we'll talk about momentarily, okay? Another choice that's different to prior productions is that unlike their much more elaborate and verdant staging, this production, set inside a literal park, is very unusually barren. The stage is just a black plane in front of you. It's got a lowered section in the center, and it has these black, completely unadorned pillars, which sort of look like they're just part of the rigging. And midway through the show, they are turned around and you see that there are actually mirrors that are on the other side, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But for the most part, they are pretty barren looking. And this, straight away, was quite unusual. I've got a picture on screen right now of what that looked like surrounded by the actual park that's just always there. It was a really unusual contrast and something that I didn't expect from a show that's trying to transport you to a land far away. Instead, this one kind of didn't try and do that with the set design in many ways. And I don't hate this, but I also wonder what could have been had the set been dressed with just more stuff. I recently saw 101 Dalmatians at this very same theatre last summer, and they made some really interesting choices there. So I know that this theatre, despite being outdoor, is capable of having some quite unique design applied to it, but in this case, they just didn't choose to. Now, I mentioned the Haitian presence throughout. There is a huge amount of really wonderful costume design and also some props that are kind of integrated and just generally a feeling, a vibe of Haitian voodoo, because it's Haitian gods that are present throughout the story. The main character, the girl who falls in love with this boy, she's called Ti Moune, and she essentially has her life orchestrated by these four gods in various ways, and she ends up conversing with them and sort of meeting them almost indirectly on her journey. And I loved the way that they brought these Haitian deities to life and really gave them so much character in a really wonderful way. I'm a massive mythology guy in general. I think that all cultures, when you dig into their mythologies, it's so rich and so vibrant, the kinds of stories that are told there. And to have that surfaced in this in the way that they succeeded with today was joyous. Melissa Simon Hartman is responsible for the costumes of those gods, and each of them were very different. One of them had this sort of skull on a top hat type situation. You can kind of imagine what I'm talking about most likely from that description, but the way that his look then was very highly contrasted to another god that had a kind of ship built into his hat, another woman who was clearly more associated with like the Mother Earth type character. She had flowers in her hair and her hair was sticking up in interesting angles, and I thought all of Melissa Simon Hartman's costume design was spot on. So moving back to the narrative for a moment, the story begins and you're introduced to this narrative frame, and straight away I was like, okay, interesting, a choice. And then a couple songs in, you meet this main character, Ti Moune. She is played by Gabrielle Brooks. She was wonderful throughout, brilliant performance, so much energy in her character, and a really wonderful characterization of a kind of young adult, like not someone that is old beyond her years by any means. She succeeded in playing the naive child turned adolescent turned very young adult maybe really well through her motion and her expression and her voice and everything. I thought that she played that part really beautifully. And as she's introduced, it's this number where she keeps having to hit these really high and really sustained notes, and it's over and over again, and you sort of get to the end of the song and you're out of breath on her behalf because you can see that she's just come onto the stage and she's put in such a shift there. And this musical theming persisted through a lot of the show. It's got really an interesting score. So the book and lyrics are both by Lynn Ahrens. The music is by Stephen Flaherty. How do you pronounce that? Flaherty? How do you pronounce that without sounding like you're being silly? Flaherty? Like I want to give it a but not sure. Either way, Stephen Flaherty's music is divine through this show, but it's paired with lyrics from Lynn, which were never outstanding in my view, but they also never really don't work. I was actually in the process of watching it trying to figure out the rhyme schemes that they were using through various different songs, because it kept subverting my expectations. You'd have almost a situation where it would go A, 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 B, and then that fifth B, which would sort of surprise you a little bit that it was an extension of that previous section, that previous phrase, that would then end up setting the tone for the next verse or whatever, that would then be a load of B's. Maybe it would be like a B, B, double C, B type situation. But it was just a set of techniques there that you don't often see, I think, in other musicals right now. The contemporary musical style currently is very different to this. And obviously various different composers and lyricists, etc., have had influence on this. Like, let's, for example, take one of the most easily recognizable styles, which is Lin-Manuel Miranda. His style has so much internal rhyme going on, and it's so often instantly clear that he's trying to make words tumble into position, but you don't necessarily know exactly where they're going at the start of the line. Whereas in this show, it's much more telegraphed. Like, I remember there being one part of the music in one of the songs fairly late in the musical, and I don't know if I've mentioned this, there's no interval, by the way. This is a short production too. It's about 90 minutes. So just past the halfway mark, there was a song where I think Ti Moune's father, at the point where she's having to be said goodbye to, and she's going to go and chase down this boy she's in love with, and the father is kind of lamenting it, says something like, "Oh, Ti Moune, you grew up too quick." And then just a few meters away, the mother says, yes, you did. It makes my heart sick. And it's like, okay, this is super simple at this point. We're not doing anything really complex here whatsoever. And it's not that I was sitting there going, I wish they were being more kind of brainy with their rhyming, but rather it meant that I wasn't captivated by the lyrics and by that kind of flow in the way that I might have been in a different show. But instead, my focus was much more on the music, the actual melody, and the harmony, because this show has really, really beautiful harmony throughout. It has a lot of folks on stage at almost all times. The opening number, I think I counted 16 people on stage. And while this obviously does decrease and increase and decrease and increase through the show, there's always this feeling that whether it's kind of the rabble of the locals in Haiti, or when they move on to the rabble of the peasants, or when Ti Moune ends up chasing Daniel down, that rich boy that she's looking for, and she ends up at this hotel that's also full of a load of other rich people. There's just a lot of folks present, and that means that there's a lot of voices to create a really lush visual and especially sonic tapestry that is unbelievably satisfying. There's one moment, so the character Daniel is played by Stevenson Arden Sodge, I think his name is, and he comes in and meets Ti Moune and they're singing, and Ti Moune's voice in the melody does some kind of step up. It's da da or whatever, and her voice, which is has a lovely texture to it and is very crisp, was contrasted so beautifully with the slight raspiness. Stevenson's voice is very breathy. It almost sounds like he's singing through like a wooden tube or something at times. It's lovely. I don't want to make out like it's like a distasteful sound or something. It's really great. This bright sound of her voice ascending, contrasting with this much more airy voice that's obviously lower, but then descending in the melody and creating this contrasting melody and contrasting motion in the music was just, God, it was so good. And this happened a bunch of times through the show. I really want to commend Stephen Flaherty for the score, because I thought it was rousing and emotive and joyous and celebratory, exactly where it needed to be. But at other times, it had a sinister edge to it, especially when the gods were present. In one song, I've written down which one it was, because at the time I was having a religious moment. It's a song called Discovering Daniel, but it's crossed with a song called Pray. So you have this melody which is being sung, but it's so 1,000,000% written based on steel drums, those steel pan drums. And so you've got this sort of do 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 do, which is a very sort of calypso melody as well, I think. And so that's being repeated across these lines. Ba 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 again. Ba 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 again. And so that sounds great, right? It's building this sort of sinister tension, and then it builds and it builds and it builds. And then again, like I said before, it's one of those situations where you have maybe an A-B rhyme scheme, but then you have this fifth line and it's extending the phrase, and it's something like, and the girl who put herself in their way, this fifth line, and pray. And as soon as you hear that and pray, and it's the whole chorus doing it, and it sounds really powerful. You had something that I've never heard before, so my ears today were blessed with something new, which happens so rarely. But it was the sound of steel drums combined with an electric guitar playing in unison that same calypso kind of melody that I just mentioned, the ba 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 ba, and with the sort of raw, like, crunchiness of the electric guitar, getting that kind of sound in, but combining it with the same but different kind of vibe that you get from a steel drum, that same kind of timbre. Oh, I could talk about this for another 30 minutes. It was so satisfying. I loved it. And this sort of thing happens so rarely. So I, from that alone, was enamored by this moment and by that song. But there were several other moments throughout the musical where certain characters would have their song. At one point, one of the female gods, who was so wonderful, she's got this massive number, quite a challenging number, I think, and made it look so effortless. And the harmony of the chorus with her, and it was just so fantastic. So sonically, musically, this show really bowled me over in a way that I was not expecting at all. Because I went in, again, so tuned to this current style of musical contemporary composition. And then when these rhymes started subverting my expectations, and these rhythms and the pacing and all of these sort of elements came together in ways that my ear was totally not used to, I was sort of sitting there going, ooh, is this bad or is this just different? And by the end of the show, I was very, very clear on my understanding that it was different and it was fantastic. It wasn't bad in any way. So on that front, it's a 5-star show. Hands down. Also, actually, I really want to give credit to Phil Bateman, the musical supervisor, Neve Gaffney, the associate sound designer. I'm sure there were a bunch of other folks involved in the sound design for the show too. But the mics situation, perfect. Everyone was exactly the right volume. It's the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre. That is not going to be an easy place to implement interesting technical sound design in because it's open air, man. And yet they made some really fun choices. They had some sounds that were really behind the audience at times that worked really well. But just in general, the sound coming from the actors I thought was superb throughout. And I am a stickler for this stuff. So I wanted to give credit to Phil, Neve, and the rest of the team working on audio for this because I thought they did a really good job. So far, not super obvious as to why it was as empty as it was. Let's move on. There were some negatives. This isn't quite a 5-star show for me, but the reasons why are fairly nuanced. It isn't just as easy as me saying, I thought that the set design was too sparse and thus it loses a star. It's not like that. It's more, I think, maybe the fault of the book, potentially. And it's a difficult position to be in because as someone sort of reviewing a show, I continuously, despite having seen, I don't know, maybe like 30 musicals in my life, whether I should judge a production's retelling of a whatever story on the book's flaws or if I should isolate it to the production itself's own choices. Obviously, nobody that put the show on at the Open Air Theatre in Regent's Park this year is the writer of the book. But at the same time, I am giving them credit for performing so well Stephen Flaherty's music. And so I think in this instance, it is valid to critique the story a little bit. So I mentioned it's a short show, 90 minutes or so. The start of the show, all these group numbers together, really emotive and evocative. And you have the introduction of the gods, really evocative again. But then the story progresses and Ti Moune chases Daniel to this hotel, right? And pretty much as soon as she steps into that world and you get the rotation of the pillars on stage, so it becomes the sparkly kind of rich person area, the rich person world instead of the poor person world, the pacing of the entire show really slows down. It goes from being at sort of an 8 or a 9, really, really jovial and pushing forward, to sort of a 6. And granted, they're trying to have some more intimate numbers. They're trying to show the emotional development between the two of them and start to explore the theme and the fact that Ti Moune is not going to be able to marry this guy, Daniel, who she loves, just because, again, of the class differences between them. In doing so, it just felt like it lost momentum instead of keeping me enthralled for those numbers that needed to be slower. Like a slow song can still have you on the edge of your seat. And in this case, it just felt like I sat back a bit. In fact, I think I actually physically did sit back a bit at that point because earlier on as well, like they're putting on accents for the entire show and it's quite a thick accent. Like the word tree becomes tree or twee. Like they fully leaned into that for the entire thing. And so I was sort of working quite hard to understand all the lines and still even so missed quite a lot of them, I'd say, through the show. But it didn't actually impact my enjoyment of it, which more often than not it would do. But in this case, I didn't mind too much because again, I wasn't so focused on the lyrics. Like I said before, I was focused on the music. So I think I cared less that I did lose a little bit of the wordiness. Anyway, it gets later on and I just sort of sat back a little bit. I was a little bit less pulled in, I suppose, to the world. And I think part of this as well is because the story itself isn't something that I think is actually that interesting, or rather it's got an interesting palette in front of it, but then it doesn't utilize those colors to paint the picture kind of thing. Like there is so much exploration that could be done of some really interesting conflicts within this world that's being established. The conflict in Haiti, for example, those local militia versus the people that are just trying to live their lives. The French colonialists in the French Antilles and their relationship with the, again, local people around them trying to live their lives. The conflicts between the different gods when the different gods disagree on the fate of Ti Moune and how she should be dealt with. The conflict of Daniel and Ti Moune. The conflict of Ti Moune and the woman who Daniel is going to marry instead of Ti Moune. The conflict of Ti Moune versus Daniel's family. Like all these sorts of things are kind of there. You see them, but I didn't feel like they were dug into. So the gods sort of end up giving Ti Moune this choice of, well, you can take your own life or you can take his. And the first time round, to save Daniel, she sacrifices herself. And then later in the show, she's given the choice to reverse the decision, and she still chooses to sacrifice herself. And it's like, okay, this god of death has you in his clutches now, you belong to him. But she still lives for an extra couple weeks after making this really important choice. She literally chooses not to kill him, and she lives for 2 weeks just so that she can see him get married and can sort of go, oh, but what about me? And then once those 2 weeks have passed and the marriage has happened, yeah, she's just claimed by that god of death. And it's like, okay, well, that's cool. And then again, we're talking about the end of the musical here, the end of the story. So spoiler alert, I guess. But then directly after that, you find out that she was turned into a tree, and the tree grows in the hotel gate and stops it from closing so that the peasant people, the poor people, and the rich people can't be separated anymore. And then in the branches of the tree, 2 young people fall in love, one from each class. So that's why we tell the story, because sort of history repeats itself in that sense. But there is no catharsis whatsoever. It's actually quite bizarre. All of this happens, by the way, in the space of 5 minutes max. But you end up with this unusual conclusion where the future generations are set to sort of fall in love with one another from these different classes once again. But there's nothing in there. And they say that like the curse is broken, they're free to love each other. But earlier in the musical, it was made very clear that loving a girl is different from marrying the girl. And that's exactly what happened with Daniel and Ti Moune. Daniel loved Ti Moune, but just didn't marry Ti Moune. She wasn't a girl that you marry. She was a girl that you love. And you get to the end of it, and it sort of feels like, well, we haven't explored the actual class differences here. We haven't explored the colonialist undertone of everything. It's not even an undertone. It's the tone of the show. It's so vitally important, but they don't really dig into it. They don't really try and subvert it. And part of that is because, I suppose, a tree growing in a gate doesn't solve colonialism. So yes, those sorts of things are doomed to repeat themselves after Ti Moune is gone in history. But then where is the catharsis? She just didn't kill a guy, turned into a tree, and then nothing. That's it. And another issue I had with it is that it sort of felt like her entire world, it was almost vain or selfish in some ways, but in others, I don't think this is the fault of her as a character necessarily, but maybe partly with the writing, because her entire existence is pinned on the opinion of a man. That's it. She's nothing else to the world other than someone who a man may or may not marry. And when the man says that I won't marry you, that's it. Like, that is the only thing she lives for, to the point that she then has to sacrifice either him or her. She chooses to sacrifice herself. Okay, how noble. Like, let the man not love you and let there be no consequences for this. I'm being a little facetious, but you hopefully take my point, that it feels like that's the only sort of thing that matters. There's no other dimension that's there. She literally, as soon as she saves his life, she falls in love with him, and that happens sort of a third of the way maybe into the musical. She falls in love with him hopelessly, and that is like the only thing that she's set on for the other. She has no other goals. She has no other motives. She has sort of no other things that she really cares about all that much. It's just this guy. She just needs to heal this guy, which turns into she's gonna stay at the guy's house for a couple weeks and they're gonna make love endlessly, and that turns into he must marry me. But it's not really romantic even. It's just sort of a fixation, and I would have liked to see that be less the sole drive of her character. I didn't feel like the choice that she made to let him live was particularly justified, because she was just doing it because she loved him once again. But it's like, babe, why? Like, surely there's got to come a point where you realize that nothing here is giving you this man is going to marry you. And so this all stacked up to mean that there was even less catharsis, and I just didn't really like that point so much. There is a counterpoint to what I've just said, which is that it had to be that way because the gods dictated it as such. Like, the gods made a choice earlier in the musical. It's all foretold. It's all prophesized. That's how these things go. And I recognize that, but at the same time, I maybe would have liked to see the push-pull between her and her fate highlighted more. There wasn't really any push-pull. There wasn't a point where the gods were offended by her actions or the gods were surprised by her actions. And this is something where in storytelling, I think that's where the most fun stories happen. Whether it's Greek mythology with Orpheus and Eurydice, and you know what's going to happen, but you still end up in tears when it does, Or something much more modern. I mean, take Harry Potter as an example. Like, you know ultimately where it's all kind of going as you get through those books towards the very end. You know what Harry's fate is going to be. But it's those moments in the final moments of Harry's pursuit of his goal, when perhaps his friends are fighting for him, or they're saying, like, we'll come with you, we can do this together. And he has this crippling realization that he's been wrestling with this prophecy for so long, so many books, and he finally has to stand up to it and live with that with just himself and himself alone. It's those moments in myths, in stories, in everything that are powerful. And I don't think that the book of Once on This Island has those, and I think misses them. So you end up with a story that doesn't really explore the colonialism present, which is a real missed opportunity, I think, because it means that there is no catharsis at the end, and there is also no sort of point at the end. And you end up with this wonderful sonic tapestry, like I said, but that doesn't necessarily serve a purpose. It's just there, and it's glorious, and it's a 5-star sonic tapestry. But I think when you kind of start to maybe break it down and look for the interweaving threads throughout, that's where it starts to look a bit more empty all of a sudden. The thing that I don't get, though, is that, like, overall, I give it 4 stars, okay? For me, it's a 4-star show. If the book was a little better, I think it would probably be a 5-star show. The production itself, every choice that they made was 5 stars, but the book is so vital to it. But all of this doesn't explain to me why it was as empty as it was. Do people just not know about this? Have they had a really awful marketing campaign? Do people just prefer The Little Mermaid and they don't want to see a Caribbean version? Like, what is the driver behind that? Because when I say that about half the seats were filled, I'm not kidding. And it deserves better. It really does. I think that it's a real tragedy. It's a real shame that more people aren't going to see this. It's a real tragedy that all of these wonderful performances, I mean, I could go on, honestly. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed this show. But like I said, Gabrielle Brooks, but also Chris Jarman as Tonton Julian, phenomenal. LeJeune Shepherd as Papa Guy, Ashley Samuels as Agway, all of them so good, so rich in their different voices and the tonality and the way that they presented themselves on the stage, and I could go on and on and on. But people aren't seeing it, and I don't get it. I'd love to hear your thoughts as to what the reasoning is. I can't imagine that it's because the book isn't good enough. Like, surely the general public don't care that much. They're all flooding into Bake Off every day, so clearly there's ways to get folks in the door, but for some reason, Once on This Island, so far from what I've seen, isn't achieving that. I mean, maybe it was a one-off day today. I'm hoping so. I pray as such. But the result is a really wonderful musical, a really wonderful production, really wonderful efforts from all the cast, but that, as things seem to stand, is going to end up as a little bit of a hidden gem that I feel like people might, in retrospect, go, man, I wish I'd actually taken the time to go see that, because it's a joy. It's gorgeous to listen to. It's different to everything else that you see on the West End right now. And as such, it's a warm 4 stars. I want to give it 5, but the book does let it down a little bit for me. But it's a warm as hell 4, and it's a strong recommendation to go see it.